everybody. Good evening. I am going to be doing a review for you of learning. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes in case there are any of you who wanted to watch the live, and I will be posting the video on YouTube as soon as I am finished. So let's go through the types of learning. We're only going to spend about 20 minutes tonight going through them. I want to give you just a couple of key concepts. With learning, we are looking at three basic types of learning. We are looking at classical conditioning. So here is the study guide. We're going to the graphic organizer we're going to go through. Those of you who are on the YouTube video, here is the organizer that we are going to do. And then we are going to talk about operant conditioning, followed by observational learning. We'll also work in there a discussion of the reinforcement schedules and how we get behaviors to continue versus how we stop a behavior. So let's go into the keys with classical conditioning. What's really important to remember with classical conditioning is that what it does is it connects stimuli and causes another type of response in the person being conditioned. So what we see with this is the stimulus gains the power to cause a response. And the reason that this can work is because of the fact that there is already a biological connection. So when we're looking at classical conditioning, you're going to think Pavlov. Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs were a great example of classical conditioning, as was little Albert. When Watson conditioned little Albert, he used something that was already able to cause a biological response. That's the first step in classical conditioning. You've got to know what the biological response already is, and then you make that occur together with something that wouldn't normally cause that biological response. This process is called acquisition. It's developing the learned response. It's pairing the stimuli. So what we see here, following along on this graphic organizer, you can see that we begin with the stimulus, anything in the environment that we can respond to. So what we have is an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus already causes the biological response. This is also called the unconditioned response. This is, for example, when Pavlov's dogs salivated to the food in the dog, to the presentation of food in the dog's mouth. So they biologically, when you put food in front of them, they salivate. It causes them to be ready to eat. They anticipate and know what is coming when they see that food. It causes the biological response. It's not something that has to be taught. This is your unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is the salivation. The conditioned stimulus doesn't happen until we pair a response that doesn't normally cause a stimuli that doesn't normally cause a biological response. So, for example, the sound of a bell. What Pavlov noticed was that every time he walked into the room, a little doorbell would ring as he entered. And then the dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell before they even got the food. Why did they do that? Well, they did that because they went through this process of acquisition. So what you have here is the unconditioned stimulus, the dog getting the food in the dog's mouth, causing an unconditioned response. It is the automatic response. In this case with Pavlov, it is the salivation. So then we've got an unconditioned, we've got a neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus doesn't cause any response. So for example, before Pavlov started feeding his dogs after the bell rang, the sound of the bell, it doesn't biologically cause a response. So the sound of the bell in this case is the neutral stimulus. When we pair the unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus, what we do is create the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is the previously neutral stimulus that, because of the process of acquisition, has gained power for the animal, the creature, the person to exhibit then the same response. So this is the conditioned response. Okay, so follow along here again as we go through and review it one more time. You have your stimulus. Any type of stimulus is something that causes anything we see in an organism that people can respond, that can be responded to. So you've got your unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. With Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, the unconditioned stimulus is the presentation of food in the dog's mouth. The unconditioned response is salivation. We pair that unconditioned stimulus with the previously neutral stimulus, the sound of the bell. As the dog gains power, as the bell is rung more frequently and then the dog is given food, this gives the sound of the bell the power to indicate to the dog that food is coming. So what we see is that pairing the unconditioned stimulus, the food in the dog's mouth, with the sound of the bell makes the dog learn that the sound of the bell will signal the arrival of food. So what happens is the presentation of the bell causes the same response. And this is now what we call the conditioned response. So we've got the unconditioned stimulus causing the unconditioned response. Pair that unconditioned stimulus with your previously neutral stimulus to create what we call the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is the previously neutral stimulus, gains its power, causes the conditioned response. So what is the conditioned response? Well, the conditioned response is typically the same thing as the unconditioned response, only it's in reaction to the previously neutral stimulus. So in Pavlov's experiment, unconditioned stimulus, food in the dog's mouth. Unconditioned response, salivation. Conditioned stimulus, the sound of the bell. Conditioned response, salivation. Let's convert that over to little Albert. In the little Albert experiment, the unconditioned stimulus was the loud banging of the gong behind the baby. What does that do? That causes him to startle and cry out in fear. That's the unconditioned response. So we pair that with the previously neutral stimulus, the white rat, so that then the little Albert learns that every time he hears that gong, a rat is going to be there. So therefore, the arrival of the rat signals the sound of the gong. So here's what happens. The little white rat is presented to Albert, to the baby. And when he sees it, he gets the same response. He startles and cries and is terrified because he has associated that that the rat signals the arrival of the gong. So making sure you keep this all together and connected. This again is classical conditioning. Anything that pairs stimuli to cause a biological response is your classical conditioning. All right. Now, here's what happens when we are being classically conditioned. We learn this association process. And then what can happen is over time, as you ring the bell more frequently and don't give the dog food, what we find is that the response diminishes. So the dog will salivate less and less. Over time, what we learn is that because this is presented, this conditioned stimulus is being presented without the unconditioned stimulus, we go through the process of what's called extinction, the diminishing of the response. Now, it does not go away completely. It just diminishes significantly when we learn that the unconditioned stimulus does not always follow the conditioned stimulus. Here's what else can happen, though. The problem is that when we are extinguishing a response, then you take a break and you come back to the same pairing later. For example, overnight, the dogs are left alone. Nobody rings any bells. Nobody feeds them. When Pavlov rings the bell first thing in the morning, the dogs experience spontaneous recovery. the recurrence or reappearance after a rest period of what had been an extinguished response. Now, those of you who were with me second semester and participated in a lemonade experiment, you may have experienced a brief feeling in your mouth that tartness. Remember the lemonade, when we put the lemonade on your tongue? That tart sensation you might have experienced the first time I said Pavlov tonight. That would have been an example of spontaneous recovery. All right, here's what else we do. And this is an unpredictable part of learning: generalization and discrimination. With generalization, what happens is any type of stimuli that is similar to the conditioned stimulus can produce a similar response. So, for example, think about all the different types of bells, all the different types of things that sound like bells: telephones ringing, doorbells, dinner bells, bells on the cat's collar, jingle bells. Any different kind of bell that is going to ring will initially cause the same response. This is generalization. Now, over time, again, we learned that this isn't always going to be the case, and that there is a difference between the types of bells. So when the phone rings, the dog will learn pretty quickly that that doesn't mean, that's not the same type of bell. So this is discrimination. So what they learn is that only certain bells will cause the response. Okay, so that gives us a quick overview of classical conditioning. The big names associated with classical conditioning are Pavlov and Watson. Those are the ones you can expect to see on the AP exam. All right, let's take a look at operant conditioning. Sometimes what we want to see is that we want to be able to train a behavior. Operant conditioning is based on Thorndike's law of effect. The law of effect says that behaviors with more favorable consequences will be repeated, and behaviors with less favorable consequences will diminish. This doesn't mean they go away completely, but they do diminish. So operant conditioning, the learning depends on the consequence that follows the behavior. So, for example, if I call Midas, Midas, come. And here comes Midas. You see him walking down the hallway? There he comes. Come on. Why? Because he gets a favorable consequence. When he arrives, he gets the attention he so desperately wants. Hi, Midas. So this is an operant behavior. What we're seeing in him is that to get something he enjoys, he'll do a specific behavior. So to teach him these things, what did we have to do? We had to use operant conditioning principles. So you reward the desired behavior with a positive consequence. This is positive reinforcement, and it will get the behavior to continue. So he loves to have his chin scratched. If I call him and he comes to me, then I'm going to scratch his chin so that the next time I call him, he comes to me. So, all right, Midas, good boy. That takes us to other examples of what happens. Sometimes we want a behavior to stop. So we're going to use a different action. This is punishment. Punishment is meant to stop a behavior. Now, here's the challenge. A lot of times we are reinforcing a behavior not intentionally. So what we're going to look at is the concept of negative reinforcement, and the fact that negative reinforcement is not punishment. Negative reinforcement still gets a behavior to continue, but it does so by getting rid of an undesirable stimulus. So that negative reinforcement is something like, think about if your mom yells at you repeatedly, clean up your room, clean up your room. The more times she nags you, the more times she yells at you, you're finally going to give in and clean it up. Why? Because you want to remove the aversive stimuli. To get her to stop yelling, you exhibit the desired behavior. And then the next time, guess what your mom is going to do? Yep, we're going to yell at you. Why? Because the last time we did it, we got the desired outcome. So that doesn't mean don't clean up your rooms, ladies and gentlemen. Please clean up your rooms and do your parents a favor. Thank you. So, or at least do what they ask you to do. So here's the thing with negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement still gets a behavior to continue. Think about taking aspirin to make your head stop hurting. The next time you get a headache, what are you going to do? If the aspirin worked, you're going to take aspirin again. Think about the seat belts. When you get into your car and you put on the seat belt, the beeping, the dinging of your car doesn't happen. If you don't put on your seat belt, what happens? You get that ding, 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 ding. Now, when I was growing up, I had a 1973 Plymouth Satellite and it went, eh, if you didn't put your seatbelt on. You're welcome. So what did I do? Put the seatbelt on. Well, not really, but I hooked it up. So that was back a million years ago. So what did we do to stop, to remove the aversive stimuli, to make the seatbelt sound go away, to make it stop? We put the seatbelt on. What does that do? It reinforces putting on the seatbelt by removing the aversive stimuli. All right. So let's talk again about punishment. Punishment decreases the likelihood of a behavior happening again. So when we punish, we have positive punishment and negative punishment. Remember, in psychology, it is not good or bad. It's the addition or removal. So positive punishment is the adding of an undesirable consequence. So spanking, putting soap in someone's mouth, giving them a negative and undesirable consequence, having to clean up all the sticks in the yard. This is positive punishment, adding an undesirable consequence. Negative punishment is also called omission training. And negative punishment is when we remove something that they wanted. So timeout, that's negative punishment. Being grounded, having your devices taken away, these are all forms of negative punishment, removing something that we wanted or enjoyed. So what that does is it decreases the likelihood of a behavior happening again. Now, of course, we all know there's a really, really big problem with all of these types of learning: thinking. Because of the fact that we think, cognition comes into play. And because we think about things, we begin to do things like weigh the consequences. Is it worth the action to have to pay what that consequence will be? Will we begin to, is there a way to get around the undesired consequence and still get the behavior that we wanted? So the concept of cognition interferes with a lot of the principles of learning, but they're still pretty solid in terms of a foundation. All right, so a couple other elements of learning that occur here that are in that cognitive level are latent learning and cognitive maps. Latent learning is learning that is not evident until there is an incentive to demonstrate it. So an example of latent learning is the rats going through the maze and not demonstrating that they have learned their way through the maze until you begin to reward them. Now, they've already learned their way, but there's no reason for them to show that they know how to get out until you give them a treat. Cognitive map. The cognitive map is your mental representation of a place. So it's the fact that the vast majority of you go to school in the morning, you park in your parking place, you probably don't think about the directions to get to school every day. Then you walk to your first period class and you go on throughout your day without having to think about the directions from one place to the next. And that's because you have a mental representation of the school, a cognitive map. Another big principle to remember with cognition and operant conditioning is the threat or possibility of over-justification. Over-justification is what can happen if we reward something that someone already likes to do. So, for example, if I were to reward Cooper for watching YouTube, eventually he's going to lose his own personal interest in watching YouTube, and he's going to start doing it because I'm rewarding him. Hey, why didn't I think of this about 6 months ago? So the over-justification effect. We'll take something, for example, think about a sport that you might have liked to play as a young child. If we began to then pay you or reward you with extrinsic motivators for doing that thing that you already like doing, then we can lose our intrinsic motivation and appreciation for that activity. Okay, so that gives us a quick overview of operant conditioning. Let's take a look at the different reinforcements and the reinforcement schedules. So you've got positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement increases the likelihood that a behavior will continue. Negative reinforcement still gets a behavior to continue, but it does so by removing the aversive stimulus. Two big types of reinforcements, primary or secondary. The only things that are primary reinforcement are things like food, water, and warmth if we're talking about it being exceptionally cold outside. This isn't just like making your classroom comfortable. We're talking about really satisfying survival needs. That's your primary reinforcement. Everything else is a secondary, and it gains its power by being associated with those primary reinforcers. So for example, money and gold stars and extra time, all of those things are secondary reinforcers. So how do we reinforce? Well, we reinforce on several different possible schedules, immediate and constant. By immediately reinforcing the behavior, the instant it is exhibited, you give a reward or a treat. You do that in order to get the behavior to continue very quickly. Now, learning under the acquisition phase with a immediate and continuous reinforcement schedule gives us very fast learning and very fast forgetting. Delayed reinforcement, a little bit of time after the behavior. This gives us the ability to more strongly encourage exactly what we're looking for. It is also more resistant to extinction. However, the big problem with delayed reinforcement is that the acquisition period takes longer. All right, let's take a look at the reinforcement schedules. Continuous reinforcement, every single time Midas exhibits the behavior I want him to exhibit, I give him a treat. So in the beginning, when we are shaping or getting him to move towards the desired behavior, what we see is every single time he sits, I give him a treat. Eventually, I have to back that down because what happens otherwise is this continuous and immediate reinforcement will cause him to then forget quickly when he isn't reinforced every single time. So let's talk about the partial reinforcement schedule. A partial reinforcement schedule, there are two different types of partial reinforcement. One is on the basis of time, one is on the basis of numbers. And this is that we don't reward the behavior every single time, but based on either a set amount of time that the behavior is repeated in or numbers. So for example, our ratio schedules are based on the numbers. So we have fixed ratio and variable ratio. With fixed ratio, we reward the response after a desired number of times. So if we want the rat to press the bar, then every time he presses the bar, the third time, we'll give him the treat. Now, here's the issue with that reinforcement schedule. You get him to learn that after the third bar press, he gets the treat. Why is that bad? Because then what he does is speeds up the behavior in a very short amount of time, which also makes it more susceptible to extinction. Variable ratio gives us an unpredictable number of correct responses. So what that means is that sometimes you give him the treat after 1 bar press, sometimes you give him the treat after 8, then the next time you give it to him after 2, then the next time maybe after 7. It doesn't matter, but it varies and it's unpredictable. That variable ratio is slower learning, and it is based on an amount of time, on the number of responses, over an unpredictable number of those responses. So fixed ratio is also like piecemeal. So for example, if I am paying you to wash dishes and I pay you for every 10 dishes you wash, every 10 plates, then that is a fixed ratio schedule. And the problem is that means we tend to lose quality. Why? Because you want to wash more plates. Don't you want to get paid more? So that means you're going to do less of a job because you're getting paid on the basis of the number you wash, not on the quality of your washing. All right, let's take a look at the interval schedules that are on the basis of time. So we have fixed interval and variable interval. The fixed interval rewards only the first correct response after a defined period of time. So with the fixed interval, we might reward the response every hour on the hour, or every 24 hours. Think about your mail delivery. Typically, mail delivery is on a fixed interval schedule, and what happens is you see an increase in the desired behavior as the time approaches, because we know that the mailman comes at the same time every day. And therefore, if we're waiting for something, whether it's the UPS driver or the mailman who comes at the same time every day, we start checking the mail more frequently as that time draws nearer. The variable interval schedule rewards the first correct response after an unpredictable amount of time, and it varies, it changes. So in the first series of the rat pressing the bar, you might reward it after 3 minutes, and then you might reward it after a minute, and then you might reward it after 8 minutes. But it's an unpredictable amount of time, and it doesn't matter how many times the rat presses the bar during that amount of time. So variable interval is very, very slow learning. And the problem with issue with variable interval is that once it's learned, it is very hard to extinguish. All right. So that takes us through the first two big types of learning. Let's take a quick talk about observational learning. Observational learning is exactly what you would think it is. It is watching and copying. So observational learning can best be seen by going back to Albert Bandura's experiment with the Bobo doll. Remember the Bobo doll and what the children did by watching the adult, the video of the adult play with the Bobo doll. And the adults kicked it, threw it, hit it, punched it, and then the children, just from watching the video, that's all. They were not told to pay attention. They weren't told to copy the behavior. They were just shown the video and then put in the room with an array of toys, including the Bobo doll. Immediately they would go to the Bobo doll and they would exhibit not only the same behavior, but an exaggerated form of that behavior. So we saw innovation and novel use of the toy in order to express more anger and aggression than they had seen in the first video, watching the adult. So what this told us, this is where we began to study the impact of violent video games. Yes, I know you've heard it so many times before. However, there is an awful lot of truth to the studies that say that when we observe, when you spend more time watching violent television and playing violent video games, it tends to normalize the behavior. And then we copy that behavior and repeat it. You can see this in language. You can see this in actions. And as I said, this is exactly observational learning. The one word that you want to make sure you're familiar with observational learning is modeling. And modeling is the process of observing a behavior and then repeating it. All right, so I see there are only a few people out there on the Instagram Live, so I am, unless there are any immediate questions, I'm going to run you quickly through a list of terms that you can take a look at. This is in the review packet that I gave you. Let's turn it this way and take a peek. Partial type of reinforcement schedule. So tell me, let's run through any questions. Anybody have any questions? Take a look at these terms. Make sure you recognize them. Okay. Generalization, extinction, continuous reinforcement, observational learning, variable interval, uh, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. Counter conditioning is one term that we didn't really talk too much about, but counter conditioning is the process of learning a new association to replace an association that was made that is maybe not a very healthy one. So the problem was for little Albert that they didn't know how important counter conditioning was. So poor little Albert ended up generalizing his fear and became very, very stressed over the course of his life. He actually died relatively young. And thank goodness Watson lost his job over that traumatizing incident. All right, so I am going to say that is over 30 minutes, which is way longer than I intended for it to be. I hope you guys have a great night, and we will get another review in tomorrow. Tomorrow in class, we will be doing the Q&A session, so come with questions. I will be answering the questions that you've been composing and putting in the box in the front of the room, and then we will have another review available tomorrow evening that I will also post on Instagram and YouTube. Have a great night, everybody.